So when you start speaking about something you care about, little bit here, next time a little bit more, you're going to be scared and nervous maybe, but it gets easier and easier. So I'm glad that you're doing that, Nora. And write to me at tinkertour@gmail. Tell me what you're speaking up about, Nora. I want to hear.
Fantastic. And if I start to tear up, it is truly because one of my mom's favorite statements for life was "kids are people too," and this is why we had to start with Nora. So thank you very much. Got a couple questions from teachers. As well, and so I'll try to combine a couple. But uh, with how politicized everything is, how do teachers promote the freedom of speech in public schools, particularly teaching subjects like racial and social justice? I'm looking off to a second monitor for the question. Sorry, but this one is now your advice to teachers on how they can engage these conversations as well with their students.
Yes, well, talking about free speech with students is something that students normally love to talk about because they have the feeling of being a discriminated group, most kids. And so, when it comes to free speech and kids speaking up, they want to talk about it. And there are issues that they care about, as you know so well. So, I mean, it is taught in our country, it's part of our Constitution. And students need to know all the parts of the First Amendment. And as I tell students, the First Amendment is like your muscles, the rights of the First Amendment. If you don't use them, you could lose them. So you want to use those rights to keep them strong. And you can start with some issue. What do they care about in their school? Maybe the lunch hour is not long enough. Maybe they're tired of something on the virtual, maybe they feel like they're not allowed to turn off their who knows? There's all these issues now that are new that have to do with virtual schooling. Whatever issue it is, from racism to being able to wear a cap in school. I mean, they can, I always tell them, you have two choices, something you care about. You can do nothing, but that's so boring. Or you can do something. You can do something. You can use one of your five rights. And I like to also pass along that it can be kind of fun to speak up about the things you care about and that it's a good way of life. Not every part of it is fun and a lot of it is difficult, but it's still a good way of life. And you don't win all the time, but it's a good way of life.
Fantastic. I want to remind people to keep the questions coming as well, and I'll thank David Jenkins, Roy Gallagher for asking those teacher-based questions. I have another teacher-based question as well, a little bit of a follow-up from Patrick Hall. I teach a unit on protesting to my students using the young adult novel All American Boys. I frame it around this idea that there are effective and ineffective protests. What, in your opinion, are the elements of effective and ineffective protests?
Well, yes, that's very interesting. It depends on what effect you're talking about, because if we're looking out for the mental health of students, which we are now, especially, and as a nurse, I'm so aware of that right now, it could be very healing just to speak out about something, just to go down to the store where you were mistreated and stand there and do your little protest, whatever it is. I mean, that could be very, very effective in making you feel better. So it really, there's different, purposes. There are different things to be gained. When I ask students, every time I ask students, well, what do you care about? And they say, well, we couldn't, you know, our class was too short or this, that. So what did you do? Well, we went to the school board and we talked about it. And I said, well, how did you feel when you went to the school board? And they always say, oh, it was great. So I think there's just something about speaking up about things that is good for students. It's good for their social, emotional health. It's good for their physical health. It's good for everything. So, and then if you really want to change a policy, which is the goal, there are some groups too, like we were talking about Project Citizen earlier today, which is really good because they try to find, the kid finds an issue that affects them in their community, in their local community, that's affecting their life. And then they look at the policies, like who is responsible for the decisions about this? Where are the points of power where we could get involved? How could we do it? So it's about changing actual policies. And so I think that's really a good way to look at things when it comes to effective protest. like students who are protesting gun violence. Okay, well, what are the laws in your local area? What are the laws in Ohio? How does this affect the number of teenagers who are shot and killed? What is the leading cause of death in your community? That'd be a good thing for students to find out. Do a little research. Like the leading cause of death usually is car crashes. So then, you might want to have driver's education instead of putting in metal detectors. I mean, it just depends. So kind of look at it logically, approach it from a public health point of view, I think a little bit usually helps whatever problem it is you're working at. Longer lunch line, you have too short of a recess. Look at how that's affecting the student's health. You can, look at it from all different aspects, but I think that's effective also.
And I love the emphasis on the big picture too, right? Sort of getting out of our own way and advocating of something larger than ourselves as well. That is fantastic. One more question, another question from Esther says that the examples that Ms. Tinker is using of young people exercising their First Amendment rights are all progressive. But what happens when young people want to say things that are ugly and hateful? How do we balance the desire for free speech to be inviolate with the concern that saying hateful things is dangerous, which I believe it is?
Yes, I know. Well, you just put your finger on the big debate right now in free speech is what are the limits of hate speech? Should there be more limits? I've always sort of leaned towards the idea that we should talk about things. We should have more dialogue and less censorship. When students this was in California, and there's a very big case that grew out of this called Dariano. Some students wore T-shirts mocking the Mexican kids. They wore American flag T-shirts on Cinco de Mayo to basically mock the Mexican kids. So they were stopped from doing that. They were censored under Tinker because they said that you are impinging on the rights of others, and they predicted a substantial disruption. So they stopped the kids from wearing those shirts, and the case was even appealed to the appeals court where the students lost there also. Personally, I thought the school could have encouraged dialogue between these two groups. And there's a wonderful story about a principal in Oregon who did that, actually. He had the kids run a trial on the stage of the auditorium, and each group got to discuss their point of view. And then the principal agreed to abide by the ruling in the end. But I think there should be more dialogue and less censorship myself. But on the other hand, you have to have school to be a place that's safe, where kids feel safe. And that comes up a lot with things like the Confederate flag in school. There's a school district in Virginia that just ruled that we're going to allow Confederate flags in school. They said, why? Because it's not disrupting school, because everybody there likes the Confederate flag, except for like the 5 or 10 black kids that go there that didn't like it at all. So under Tinker, they could have censored the Confederate flag because of impinging on the rights of others. So yeah, these are all debates that are going on all over the country right now. So I'm glad you're all, following this and weighing in too, because it's being debated.
Well, and thank you so much. And I'll spin this a little bit. There was a question from Mia, and what she asked stems from what you said and what's been in my head for a while too. I'm a licensed attorney, so I suppose I should probably love it when cases go to court, because I get to watch the legal arguing. Mia's question is, when you wore the armbands, did you know that you were pushing the edge of free speech? In other words, when did you realize this question became a legal one and not just a social, moral one?
I had no idea that this was all going to, develop the way that it did. I had that sense of fairness that I think so many kids do. I felt like it wasn't fair that we were being stopped from wearing our armbands because we weren't hurting anybody. And I had no idea that it was going to become a big legal issue. Just none. I just didn't get it.
And and one of the things that it sort of inspires me to carry these conversations further is what happens to a question like yours when it gets to a court, and what we lost. We might have won ultimately legally, but what we lost when the question became a legal one and not a social, moral, educational one, right? Instead of the principal or holding a mock trial in his school, that could have been a lawsuit, and there may have been a win and a loss in the court, but what have we won and lost by turning the question to court instead of where the issue lives on a daily basis, for
Yeah,
example?
I think that's right. I think there should also be a lot more diversion of cases in general for students. There could be teen courts, and a woman that I know, Margaret Fisher in Seattle, is very involved with teen courts there, and there are others around the country where students that have violations of various kinds, some of them are minor legal violations, traffic violations, etc. It goes to teen court, and the teenagers, rule on it, and they can keep the kids out of the courts in that way. But yeah, I think a lot of times these things should be dealt with in other ways besides the legal system.
And I do appreciate that. My job as a lawyer is to keep people out of court, so I'm a fan for sure. I have a question from Clara, and this is, she said, I'm a student journalist in my high school. How would you approach writing about more controversial topics? So obviously we have different forms of speech, and this one is a question about written speech.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Claire, because this case has a lot to do with student journalism. And in my travels, I've spent a lot of time working with student journalists and student journalism organizations like the Journalism Education Association and the Student Press Law Center, which is really a wonderful resource in Washington, D.C., but they also have someone in Washington State, and you can reach out to them and they give free legal advice. But yeah, there's a whole, a field of working with your newspaper or your administration, and depending on how they are and how much they understand. The problem is a lot of administrators don't understand journalism. They don't understand the role of the free press. They might be good in many ways, but they're not really, don't have a background in journalism. So they don't understand the role of journalism and how, yes, it is going to be controversial. Um, some students in New Jersey with the Pickwickian, they refused to put the word redskin in their paper. This is starting about 5 years ago. And they explained that it was because when they looked it up in the dictionary, it said, offensive term for Native American people, and they weren't going to do that. So their advisor was suspended for a couple days. They got punished, these kids, but in the end, they won out and they got all these awards from other people instead. And now they've been vindicated, of course. But it's just, it's a very interesting field, journalism. I'm so glad that you're into it, and there are many issues. But yeah, you want to try to work with your administration and your advisor, and don't shy away. The biggest problem, I think, with a lot of us in the country and in the world is self-censorship. End up censoring yourself before anybody even has a chance to censor you. So you just think, oh, I better not talk about that. That's going to be a problem. And some kids tell me around the country, like they're more worried about the students hassling them than they are about the administration hassling them for saying certain things. So, groups like JEA or the Student Press Law Center can help you navigate some of that. And you can also write to me. I'll help you out with some too.
Excellent. And what does JEA stand for again?
The Journalism Education Association. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. This one comes from Rachel. It's related a little bit too, but from a teacher. I have many students whose voices that are drastically different from their parents in the community. You've spoken a little bit to this already, but what are ways that we can inspire students and kids to step up and realize that their voices matter? Especially in those areas where they feel everyone around them or a lot of people around them disagree drastically.
Yeah, a lot of, I was lucky. My parents, we got my dad to come over to our side to agree with us. But, students ask me, well, what do I do? I don't know of any adults, or my parents don't agree with me on this, various issues that are are controversial. So I said, you know, try to find someone that you can get some support from, whether it's a teacher, an organization, a friend, you know, like that, to help you out with that. But it can be really difficult, and you can feel alone. And so, yeah, we don't want you to feel that way. We want you to speak up, and you know, teachers can help with that a lot too. You can listen to students, ask them, what issue do you care about? And most times students will tell you there's something that's on their mind, they're thinking about, and just try to listen and, you know, show respect.
I very much appreciate that. I'm curious about how, because obviously I've read the case again this past week, but I'm curious about. There's some talk in the case about how, well, it wasn't substantially disruptive. It was only a handful of students. I'm curious about how many planned to do this and how many actually showed up with the armbands. You said it wasn't very many, but were there some people who were deterred even, you know, the night before, as it were?
Yeah, there were 50 kids. It was planned at Roosevelt High School, across town, and from where we live. So there were 50 kids who had signed up to wear the armbands approximately. People like Bruce Clark, Ross Peterson helped to plan it. But then when the principals came out with their ruling, which was like 2 days before we were scheduled to wear the black armband, um, it dropped way down. So in
Yep.
the end, there were less than 10 kids that wore the black armbands. Well, Perry Hutchison wore his black armband on the wrong day. So it was before there was a rule against armbands, so nothing happened to him. It could be the Perry Hutchison case, but so he didn't get suspended. But yeah, less than 10 kids wore the armbands. 5 students got suspended, and 3 went to court. Me,
Got
my
it.
brother, and Chris Eckhart.
I have a couple questions on deck. This one we could talk about for a while, but it's an important one too. Um, this is from Joe. In what ways are the advent of social media technology and the modern provocateur affecting free speech? I'll say with young people, but maybe young people of all ages. There's an example in parentheses, Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, but the provocateur
Yeah,
who uses technology
yeah,
to
yeah.
engage.
No, it's really important. And there was a case at the Supreme Court around adults and Facebook, and a guy, he had threatened his girlfriend on Facebook, was what happened, and he ended up winning that case. But there hasn't been a case for a student speech at the Supreme Court having to do with social media. But yeah, it's a huge issue. I mean, I think it's one that students need to get involved with, and teachers as well. What is going on in that area? What is all the controversy with Facebook and Twitter, and what are other countries doing to limit some of the false and misleading information? Why are so many people mad at Mark Zuckerberg because he's not? I mean, you know, it's good to keep up on this, and you know, weigh in on it. When also net neutrality, something that students and teachers, all of us who care about young people and who care about democracy, need to weigh in on and know what's going on there. And so many students did. I mean, I think a million people weighed in on the threat to net neutrality and were able to keep that. But it's a huge issue. All of these things are. There was a girl in Minnesota. I think her name was Tyler, and she was like in 6th grade or something. So they tried to get her password. She wrote something like "I hate school." I can't remember exactly what she wrote, but so the principal asked for her password, and she refused, and it went to court actually, and she won. She had to. They had to pay her um, punitive damages. So yeah, a school cannot demand your password, but there are lots of issues having to do with social media for sure. It's good to see students using social media in so many constructive ways, though. I mean, it gets kind of it's a huge issue, but there is a lot of good to be had there.
I agree entirely. So, what advice would you give to administrators who wish to, and this could actually happen in higher ed as well, who wish to regulate the conduct of students online. In social media, we can talk about online learning too, but in social media, as it may or may not affect what goes on campus. Things like cyberbullying, harassment, things like that. Not necessarily political speech, but do you have any advice for administrators on those measures?
Well, I would like to recommend this book that just came out from a man that I know very well, Tom Jacobs. Maybe you can't see it, but it's called
Yep.
Cyberbullying Law. It's got every possible case, every situation you could ever imagine. It's a really wonderful book. Just came out, Cyberbullying Law by Tom Jacobs. So that's one thing. But yeah, it's a huge problem because administrators don't want to be monitoring every Snapchat and every, but um, then again, people expect, administrators to be accountable and to know if some kid is suicidal or if some kid is homicidal. And, you know, we have to work on preventing kids to get to that point. First of all, number one, as a nurse, I would say.
Yep.
But also, it's just, I think the students need to help figure it out and to be involved in the solution also. What are the solution to these problems? Like administrators don't have to be out there all on their own by themselves trying to figure it out. And like I went to the school administrators conferences, and things, and talked to them. I know so many of them are really sincere and care and want to do the right thing, but it's hard, and I think they need some help from the students as well.
That would be great to expand the dialogue. And so speaking of expanding the dialogue, this is a lovely segue. But we do have some participants, some attendees tonight who are taking higher ed law and studying to be higher education administrators. How have you seen the Tinker case and ruling apply in higher education settings?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, the Tinker ruling applies to public schools, of course, because the First Amendment applies to government censorship and government actions. So it applies to public universities and public colleges, but in some ways it's a stretch to apply it to universities. But I think you're probably more of an expert on that, Dr. Pauken, than so why don't you just weigh in? I know some of these cases, like the Hazelwood, we talked about, have
Yes.
applied in
Yep.
colleges. The Hazelwood censorship of journalism has been applied in very strange ways, sometimes in universities. But yeah, what do you say about that?
So I can highlight Daylan, one of my students who was supposed to put you on the spot, is about to put me on the spot. That's okay. It's all good. Yeah, I think the substantial disruption standard as a legal standard applies in higher education public settings as well. Perhaps our measure of substantial disruption may change a bit because students are not here as captive audiences. They're older, more mature, presumably, but maybe developmentally, but can engage dialogue, discourse on controversial subjects in a different way from students who are younger ages still learning how. I think the legal right applies to everyone, and I think it applies equally, but perhaps case by case, the measure of substantial disruption or the collision of rights with others may vary depending on the context. The fascinating piece for me in the higher ed sort of stretch from Tinker to other free speech cases and their application to higher ed really is less about student protest and the disruption standard, because I think that applies pretty consistently. It really is when the forum becomes less public, when we go into publications, when we go into classrooms, that's where the K through 12 rulings like Hazelwood and Bethel probably don't apply as readily to higher ed settings. There may be that kind of arbitrary adulthood line, right? That may have some impact there. Maybe judges are swayed by the age of a traditional college student, and therefore Hazelwood shouldn't apply. The curriculum-based case in K through 12 shouldn't apply with the same force. And I tend to agree with that. There is, as a higher ed administrator and as a faculty member, I might argue that my curriculum, my academic freedom deserves some foundation that sort of I get to say what goes kind of thing. But but I hope it doesn't apply with the same force that it has in K through 12. I'm a fan of student academic freedom. So I don't grow unless they talk, right? Unless they speak. So I don't want those K through 12 cases to apply with the same force in higher ed. But I'm not so sure in all cases I want them to apply with the same force they do in K through 12. What are our pedagogical concerns, right? My pedagogical concern is I need to hear your voice, and so I might win a court case, but I'm not so sure I've won anything else.
I know there are ways that administrators can censor students legally, but my question is always, why would you? If you, unless you're really protecting a student who's going to be hurt, harmed, and that's the big debate, I think, especially in colleges, is where is the limit to speech that is hurtful, that is
Yeah.
harmful, and that is hate speech? What is the limit? What duty does the school have to protect the other students? And maybe, a lot of students are arguing. I mean, I could show you a book I have on my shelf, the argument against the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
College student who's saying that the First Amendment has been used against people of color, and that it really hasn't been very helpful. But then you get people that are advocates for racial justice who argue that no, the First Amendment has been very, very important in fighting for racial justice, and it still is. So there's a debate going on. So that's why I tell students, hey, get in on it. It's not like there's some magic answer anywhere.
Yeah, and if our attendees tonight are catching a theme, it really is this: get in on it, right? There really is room for you, and I want there to be, because I struggle greatly when we have these conversations, and most of mine, admittedly, on a daily basis, are in higher ed settings. But I would have the same feeling in K through 12. I don't want the First Amendment to be the enemy. I want it to be the tool. I want it to be the vessel, the avenue, the positive spark. And I don't know if you can say a little bit more on how we can change that message, understanding that with that message comes some speech that really is hate speech, that really is hateful, but somehow still lawful.
Well, yeah, I think, a lot of the hate speech is racist speech, and it's just another word for it. So we need to work on eradicating racism in our country, and that I think should start even at the preschool, kindergarten level, working on this. And there are lots of ways to do that. I'm trying to find my little baobab.
Beth, there's one more question that came in
Yep.
a little bit later.
Yeah.
And it is an interesting question, since we're talking about limits and we're talking about higher education. We're also talking about administrators. So Sarah Cake is asking,
Yep.
I would love to hear her perspective on what has recently occurred with the teacher, principal, and assistant principal wearing the shirts at Dublin Scioto High School near Columbus. And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier in one of our student sessions. So how about that?
Yeah, well, teachers' rights and students' rights are related. And in the Tinker ruling, it said that neither students or teachers leave their constitutional right to expression. But however, through the years, and I mean, it's a whole area of law, teachers' rights, and it's fascinating. But as there have been several cases after the Tinker ruling that cut back on the rights of students, there have also been some cases that cut back on the rights of teachers. I think Garcetti was probably one of the most harmful,
Yeah.
and there were others. But so generally, and maybe you know more about this probably than I do, that teachers basically have less free speech rights than students in schools in some ways, in many ways. I mean, teachers probably have more power in some ways, undoubtedly, but when it comes to legal free speech rights, students have more rights. So I don't know about the shirt. The shirt said like Black Lives Matter, no people are illegal, love is love, that kind of thing. And now there are issues. There's another issue in Georgia where a teacher had in the background of her video class a Black Lives Matter banner. And she was disciplined by this school, and then it was eventually reversed because, you know, people thought she should be able to have that out there. But what do you think about that, Nancy Patterson? Come on
So,
up.
so some while ago, I walked myself over. I was in DC, and I walked myself over to the NEA, and I met with a general counsel at the time. His name was Michael Simpson, and he wrote a nice article, advice to teachers that you're not going to win right now. The Supreme Court case hits about academic freedom for teachers, and it goes the wrong way for teachers. It does not go their way. Garcetti's been used as precedent in a number of these cases. I met a couple of those teachers who are really trying. Sissy Lax is someone, a case to read. Deb Meyer, such a sad case of someone honking for peace and losing their position. So we're not positioned well, but I don't know why we couldn't be. So things could change again. It's something I think in every generation. Coretta Scott King said we have to fight for justice, and it's a fight that teachers have to take on at some point. Michael Simpson's advice to teachers was work through your local school boards and local policy that can help protect you when you're teaching about controversy. But I'm afraid teachers wouldn't win.
And so go ahead, Mary Beth.
Oh, you go ahead.
I was going to say for the students who are attending, who are in our K through 12 leadership program, I'm going to argue that it's also on you. That if indeed the curriculum belongs to things larger than yourself, and you are representing the school, then you need to protect your teachers. Right, you need to go to bat for your teachers. I don't have to. If I'm a former math teacher, I don't have to be a language arts teacher to understand the goodness that a language arts teacher brings to their classroom. And if I don't let that goodness shine, then I'm not doing my job as an administrator. I can tell you the law technically. If you're wearing the educator hat, you're wearing the employee hat, we win. Well, that's easy math, and that's not the right problem, right? That's not the right solution to the problem. So I think it's also on the administrators to give their teachers some room to fly.
And I like the point that Mary Beth has been making all day. You know, she's been working hard since 2:00. She's been
She has.
with all kinds of young people, undergrads and high school students. So she's talked about it may not have legal support right now, but is it ethical? So these decisions that support teachers and support young people, they don't need legal precedent. They can happen with people who are making ethical decisions in school buildings across the US. So we
Yes.
have about 5 minutes left. I know this time has flown. I would like to ask the panelists if you have anything that struck you, any take-home messages that we'd like to leave ourselves with. And I'll start. My favorite is more dialogue, less censorship. And I think that's something that we can do right now. Right now. Those conversations, if we could be in on them at SIOTA, it would be really nice if there could be some debriefing and a lot more dialogue between parties who it appears are misunderstanding each other.
What's IOTA?
Oh, that was the school in Dublin.
Oh, yeah.
The school is, yes, a school district in the Dublin system. I mean, a school in the Dublin district.
Where they were wearing the shirts, yeah.
Yep. It shouldn't be a problem to face race or other questions in schools is my dream.
Well, yeah, I think we need to really talk about it more and start at younger ages and not be so afraid of it. Students are less afraid of it, I think, than adults to talk about things.
One of this will be my sort of closing comment with respect to some of the messages you've sent. And I want to thank you for allowing me to chat with you. My goodness, here we are in the coffee house. A few years ago, I was invited by a high school classmate who's a teacher in Cleveland Public, and she was doing a couple of weeks in a careers class that she was teaching, and she wanted people to come and talk about what they do for a living and how they got there. And so I went in, instead of just talking about what degrees I got, I brought the high school classes a case on a controversial tweet sent by a student, and by the end of the class, we weren't talking about the Twitter case. We were talking about the events in Charlottesville, and in Cleveland Public, Cleveland, Ohio. Largely students of color, and I had asked, I said, so what would you say if you had an opportunity to talk to the people who organized that protest, the racist protest in Charlottesville? I would ask the same question a lot of places that summer and fall. And my favorite answer, probably for a life, came from a young woman in the high school class. And she said, so I said, what would you say? And she said, hi, how are you? I'm like, I can't write this any better than the kids did. And so your message of let's get in on it rings true.
We can
Flex your First Amendment right muscles.
exactly, we could stand for some more reaching across. And that's what it's a skill, learning how to communicate with people who don't agree with you and having respect for people who don't agree necessarily. And we need to have more of that. And that's what it's all about. The First Amendment really says that we respect each other enough to care that you have the right to free speech. You should have the right to these things. And so I think the First Amendment is really about respect for others and caring about others.
So there is one last thing that provokes in me, and I think Art was bringing this up in the chat earlier. So we are focusing a lot on expression, but what about listening? And when I think of you, Mary Beth Tinker, I think of someone who has practice with that, and you've listened well. I watched you with students today, and they responded to the fact that you really were taking a break from whatever you might have been thinking, and you were listening well. So maybe that's something we could also work on.
Thank you. I do think that's so important. And that's another reason why the First Amendment is important, because without people having the right to speak, we don't have the right to hear their very interesting, important, productive ideas or thoughts. And so it's the same thing when kids are not encouraged to use their First Amendment rights. We're all slighted. So I'm so glad that all of you here tonight have changed this program and that you're encouraging young people to have a voice.
Well, thank you to the community for showing up in large numbers. This is something that is a little bit rare during COVID times, I think, for so many people to spend some more time in the late evening online, when especially teachers, we've been doing it all day already. So
I really I feel for people, teachers, parents, families right now so much. It's hard, and teachers, I know you're putting in a lot of extra hours these days to do the virtual thing, and parents juggling jobs, children. I have no idea how people are doing it. As a nurse involved with public health, I'm very upset that we are at this point in dealing with the pandemic. And to me, it's another reason why young people need a voice to speak up about these things.
well, if we get sad, we can email you, right?
Yay!
Anytime.
All
So
125
there's
of
there's so much that's going on that's very heartening as well. I think
it's true.
there are a lot of people, taking action, a lot of young people speaking up about the environment, about racism, about so many issues having to do with democracy and equality and justice. And that's very, very heartening.
Well, I think we have to wrap this up tonight, however sad that sounds to me. I want to thank Bill Arnold again for making this possible for us, Joe Edens in the development office at BGSU for the idea. And we want to see you back here next year when we have our Constitution Week at BGSU face to face. It's going to be really great.
Thank you to everybody who made it possible.
Yeah.
And thank you for making my Constitution Week very, very special. It was so good to be with all of you today.
So I'll just let everyone know that we did lose the first part of Mary Beth's presentation, but we got all of the Q&A session. So I'll make sure that we get that posted to Facebook. So people who weren't able to be a part of this tonight, I know there were a lot of teachers who really wanted to hear what you had to say, and it'll be a great inspiration. We love you. We thank you for your courage and your big, strong muscles and it's all that you will continue to do. We're so inspired.
And the same to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great to be with all of you. You take care, stay safe, stay well.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Good
Take
night.
good care.
Thank you. Night. Thank you.
So I'm still here. Let's see. I'm going to stop the recording.